So Nishant Shah is a feminist, humanist, and technologist, and currently the Vice President of Research at Artes University of the Arts in the Netherlands. He works as a knowledge partner with Digital Earth, a fellowship with HEVOS Foundation, where I happen to work, and with the Feminist Internet Research Network with the Association of Progressive Communication. His ongoing work is invested in understanding the state of misinformation, fakeness, and violence through the frame of techno-aesthetics, or aesthetics, if I pronounced it correctly, yeah? In order to find new processes of civic action. Nishant will give a presentation on new digital calibrations of being human, while drawing from postcolonial discourse, feminist theory, and technological history. This talk will address questions of agency, right, protection, and justice. So I'm really looking forward to the talk, and thanks a lot for coming here and being here with us.
Thank you, thank you. I still can't believe you're still hanging around. I mean, what's wrong with you? I don't have the wonderful circle that Tabitha had, so I'm just trying to surround myself with all my digital gadgets. Like that's the circle I can cast. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to come here to spend this evening and to try and present to you this thing I'm thinking through, which is about what does it mean to be human, which looks like such a ridiculously stupid question that we should stop thinking about it immediately. I had a much longer talk planned, but I'm going to cut it shorter because I don't think any of you are in a condition to take 50 minutes of me talking. So I'll run through some of the ideas and then we'll see where we land by the time it's over. So thank you very much, the Centre Pompidou, the wonderful team at HEVOS with whom working is always such a pleasure, for inviting me today to think through this notion of being human. And I think I want to begin my talk today with a story about a mad king. So in the minutes of the Society's weekly scientific meetings on the 9th of March, 1664 in England, was a very small report by Sir Robert Murray, who documented the experiments of His Majesty the King Charles II about his own weight. Turns out that King Charles II was more or less the Kim Kardashian of his time. Because as Sir Robert Murray reports, the king had the curiosity of weighing himself very frequently to observe the several emanations of his body before and after sleep, tennis, riding abroad, dinners and suppers, and that he had found that he weighed less after tennis by 2 pounds 3 ounces, but the king kind of made up for it by drinking 2 draughts of liquor after play, and after dinner, more by 4 pounds and a half. So one thinks very fondly of this reigning monarch in England, known in history as the Merry King, who surrounded his entire palace filled with boxes like this, measuring all his bodily fluids, obsessively collecting them in the name of natural philosophy, storing them as scientific measurements of his body. Right? While the story about this collection of basically shit and piss, which is kind of, collected in these fancy excrement catches is what they were called, also instituted a very particular position in the court, which was called the groom of stool, which essentially was a man who had to talk to Charles II while he was pooping, so that he is, continuously distracted and not affecting the experiment of collecting his own shit. So this particular idea of the process of the measurement is not merely restricted to the self-tracking quantification of an obsessed eccentric who was so rich that his collection of his own bodily fluids was not considered mad, but whimsically scientific. So it's important to remember that ever since we've tried to claim humanity for ourselves, we have been in a process of measurement. And then it's not something that I need to reinforce very, very, very strongly, that the process of measurement was not a benign exercise. It was a political expression of power that showed how counting, discounting, and miscounting could create a justification for some of the cruelest forms of colonization, slavery, and genocide. It goes dark really fast, from a king who collects his shit to talk about slavery and genocide. But I'll find a middle ground to tell the story. Right? So in India, the country that I grew up in, The idea of measurement of culture, of human value, and of dignity of life, was central to the logic of the British colonial expansion and violence. Perhaps one of the most striking tales of measurement, not just of being human, but of whether the humanity counts in the systems of modern logic, is the story of Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay, the Governor General of the British East India Company in 1835. So, in a document called The Minutes on Education, Macaulay grandly argued that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. For Macaulay, the native heathen, who he called a subject with a past but without a history, was in need of education and religion to save his soul. A soul that was to be saved not for the well-being of his life, but for him to become a clerk for the British colonial state. So the Minutes of Education initiated the large English literacy program set up to educate the native to become a Pakka English Sahib. Macaulay's bastards, that's what they are derisively called in India. They produce people like me, who speak in the language that the colonizer left behind and are often better versed in British literature and culture than my own local language and tradition. And I'm produced through an abstract moral compass, the local knowledges, philosophies, aesthetics, politics dismissed and destroyed as not good enough to please the empire. However, before Macaulay imported the philosophy and art and the great literates from England into India, he actually introduced something else. He introduced two systems of measurement to try and make sense of the native that he wanted to bring into life. These two took up very particular forms. One was the introduction of the ledger, like the double accounting system ledger. And the second, very strangely, was what we now call the Indian Penal Code. The independent art collective based in New Delhi called Rux Media have this wonderful time-looped video installation called An Unfrozen Archival Afternoon, unregistered on the Richter scale. The installation, as it will start slowly moving in, I think, it shows us surveyors or the ledger keepers, the accountants who were keeping count of the wealth and the resources of the British East India Company. The accounting system was not only meant to codify the domination of the British Empire, but also a way of controlling the heathen. The picture of surveyors in West Bengal reminds us that the most dominant genre of knowledge production has always been the ledger. And for those of us who work in universities, this comes with a very clear material economics, because essentially, if you sit in any departmental meeting in any university, all we talk about is our budgets. We also accidentally happen to talk about the work that we do in our classrooms, but largely talk about how much money we raise for research. Right? This infrastructural trace of information that balances on both sides to maintain a state of equilibrium. This ledger, which serves even today as a metaphor to understand database governances and quota-based affirmative action, this ledger which makes us intelligible and produces us as legible as those who would count and hence be counted. So that was the first form of kind of education that the Indian native got in order to serve the British Empire. But what's also perhaps present in this visual is Macaulay's commitment to designing the Indian native to become a Pakka Sahib, a truly honorable British man. And in the interest of this transformation, Macaulay produced the Indian Penal Code that obsessively sought to regulate the orgiastic practices of the native. Right? So he formulates something called the Unnatural Sexual Acts Law, which criminalized all sexual acts except for those penal vaginal intercourses that were intended for procreation. It introduced a series of guidelines on office architecture to curb the homoerotic excesses of the Indian native. One of which was to create boundaries in closed spaces, not allowing for the unclean male bodies to touch each other, thus succumbing to the temptation of the flesh. These boundaries, in fact, became the blueprint of how internal spaces got organized within the offices of the British East India Company, because they talked about how much space must be maintained between two men in a closed working environment so they can concentrate on their work, restrain their libidinal desires, and resist the urge to break into song, dance, and sodomy. The image loop, as it moves from light to dark, also illustrates the possibility of a homoerotic camaraderie that Macaulay imagined in the unsupervised offices of work. Because it was only once the native was taught to count and be counted, to compute and be computed, and once the native was trained to understand the penal implication of his penile desires, that the native could understand the value of literature, the power of poetry, and wonder how you can wander lonely as a cloud and chance upon a host of daffodils. That in order for the native to become an actor and a part of an audience capable of the acts of reading and interpretation, a massive design principle of accounting and policing had to come into being. Measurement of being human then clearly has an axis of power, and more importantly, a threat of categorization and taxonomy that organizes sociality, intimacy, forms of living, and conditions of death. So these histories of measurement, right, these forms of exclusion, of violence, of reform and repeal are all too familiar and commonly known by now. We've seen spectacular scholarly work on the malice of measurement and the tyranny of counting, and how the human body in all this quantification has been subject to be ordered and mapped, or as Michel Foucault would have it, disciplined and punished. If this is indeed a given truth and common knowledge, why would we want to talk about it again today? And this brings me to the proposition for the rest of the talk. Because the reason for me is very clear, that in all of these different processes and politics of counting and measurement, you could take many different sides. You could justify the need to measure in order to know the human body more, like the medicinal drawings and medical textbooks which kind of detail the human cadaver in all its flesh and sinews and musculature. Or you can also take an argument about how there is a capacity of restricting the human body by these registers of pain and violence, which are also exercised by a measurement. But no matter which side of the argument you fall under, in all of these discourses, you take for granted that the human body is the origin of these measures, right? This is a huge statement, that the biological fixity of the body, its particular form and expression, the inviolable model of completeness and discreteness, and the unwavering idea that the body is a bound, measurable, ownable thing remains unshaken in all of these conversations. So in all of these different interpretations of measurement, be they the collection of bodily fluids by a mad king, or the punishment of a ledger keeper's queer desires by a colonial power, be they the detailed paintings of a human body's musculature, or the enslavement of the body which was put onto a ship to work like a machine, in all of these, there is one thing that is given. The body is the genesis point, the beginning, the source of meaning, and the verification of truth, as well as the justification of its materiality. Or perhaps it's strange to say this, but the body for the longest time was central to the practices that measure the body, right? Lately, especially with the ubiquity of digital technologies, and this is the shift I want to kind of move towards, the glorious certainty and centrality of the body have been dislocated. Not only is the body considered disposable, but also in need of an upgrade or a burden to be escaped. Take two particular visions of human technology intertwining of the future that are quite popular in the Silicon Valley-driven hypermasculine fantasies of human futures. One is technological singularity, and the second is digital immortality. So the technological singularity, right? The idea that one day we will be able to convert the human subject into exhaustive information, follows the physical ideas that in our pure forms, we are energy. That if we can map these energy spectrums into data, which can then be stored on prosthetic life-carrying computational devices, we could live forever, no longer subjected to the mortality and the decay of our oh so fragile biological vessels. This idea of technological singularity is not just a science fiction fantasy. All right. We can cross that off my list. It's not just a science fiction fantasy, but has billionaires like Elon Musk investing futures in creating an escape hatch for their biological bodies before their time runs out. This is the vision of the beyond human. The human as data points, as information, as post-biological form, and the vision comes at a time when we are clearly facing precarious futures of global climate and the planetary capacity to sustain carbon-based life forms, clearly showing us that if the future is going to be scarce and measured, then these new augmented forms, which are going to measure up to the new forms of singularity, are also going to be the only ones that consume it. The escape from the banal humans that we are also finds its space in digital sequencing and manipulation of our DNA and basic biological life blocks. So Alphabet, the parent company that also owns the global giant Google, in 2016 launched a company called Calico. Calico made a startling promise. They have decided that the problem of human life is death. And instead of focusing on disease, well-being, and saving, they are just going to cure the very idea of death. Looking at stem cell research that reverses aging and thus reverses living, Alphabet's biogenetic subsidiaries are looking at human mutation, genetically modifying the code and DNA of being human, filling up our bodies with technologies, chips, nanoparticles, and synthetically fabricated microbial life forms, which will at some point grow us to our full potential and then stop decay, granting us immortal life. The promise of immortality very distinctly is of long life, but definitely not as a human. That this will be a new measurement of the human life and its competencies, which we are going to look forward. If these experiments find fruition, we will be in a new designer age of designer babies. I'm hoping the first one's called Gucci, where fetal DNA can be modified to give it particular characteristics. Machine measurements will be able to typify individuals before they find a voice, and decisions of who gets to choose and who should not be afforded life will be taken by algorithms that will determine the efficiency and possibility of a genetic sequence. Donna Haraway, who's probably one of the most influential philosophers of science, in her essay, The Cyborg Manifesto, had already warned us that as we move into the age of extreme computation, we are going to see a resurgence of eugenics in the form of genetics, where our ancestry, our profiles, our identities and lives will be hard-coded into the data that stands in for our human experience. I don't need to remind this audience of what happened the last time when we thought that using eugenic principles in order to organize a society was a good idea. And yet, as we start receiving the probability models of global climate change, where the world as we know it right now is going through dramatic and accelerated changes, we are increasingly getting the messages that the human as we need to know it will have to also change really fast into becoming a super species, and experiments of Calico will be the way to go forward. So while these aspirations of being human-centric, being superhuman have always abounded over mythologies and fiction, there is a certain inversion in the human technological model that's worth examining. Because even though the science fiction post-apocalyptic vision of Musk Labs and Calico are trying to propose the rise of a new life form, there is something else that's happening there. That if the older technological apparatus was to measure the human, thus working with human-centered technologies that sought to describe and determine the human and give it meaning, the new technological networks are necessarily creating a machine-centered matrix where the human has to measure up to the technological truths that are being told. And I'm going to illustrate this through very, very two quick examples, right? And I'm borrowing this from the robotic scientist Andrew Clark, who formulated the presence of natural-born cyborgs. So Clark offers a very clear distinction between machine-centered and human-centered technologies. The easiest would be that if I were to ask you right now, without looking at your watch, to tell me what time it is, you will be able to give me a fairly clear estimate of it. I'm hoping it's not because ever since this lecture started, you have been just painstakingly counting every second, saying, when the hell is this getting over? But because in your head, without having any conscious idea, there seems to be a passage of time that's being counted. Let's say you had a really wild party last night, you are very hungover, you are completely phased out, and you have no idea where you are. By the way, this is a talk that is happening, it's not a hallucination, right? And even in that space, you will be able to give me some sense of what time of the day it is, what day of the week it is, what month, what year, at least the century or the millennial. Clark says that it's not important whether your answer is right or wrong. The point is that you and I are unable to think of ourselves as anything except for human creatures which are measured through the passage of time. It's inconceivable, Clark says, to find a culture or a civilization that does not have a sense and a measurement of time. We forget that time is a completely unnatural technology. There is nothing natural about it. It is a specific form of ordering a passage of events to make human sense out of it. But time is such a human-centered technology that even without teaching you explicitly on how to stay with time or work within that, we have now recognized ourselves as people who own time. In the English language, we have a very funny thing. We actually ask people things like, do you have the time? And before they look at their watch, they say yes. And then they look at the watch and they tell you what time it's going to be. Because you know with assurance that time is something you own and something that you will be able to define yourself through. Compare itself with something else, right? Which is language, which is another form of technology. Because you would be very confident about your temporality, but you would not always be very confident about me asking, if I threw a word at you, would you know what the meaning is? Like there would be a hesitant yes. So here's supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Even if you are a Mary Poppins fan and you know what this word is, you don't really know what its meaning is. We often forget, for example, that language, which is considered to be a natural technology, is in fact an extremely machine-centered technology. Languages require repetition, training, immersion, and like complex gadgets, the older we get, the more we lose our ability to process new linguistic forms and structures. Language might be a technology we depend on the most, but it doesn't really allow us ownership. Language does not measure the human, though we use it to describe the human. Language is a standard that we have to measure up to. We need to develop competence, acquire fluency, and practice till we have met up the exacting standards that language as a technology sets for ourselves. This is a machine-centered technology that constantly sets up measures and standards against which we might fail. So I'm making this fairly long conceptual distinction to arrive at the point I want to make, that the digital systems that we are setting up around us are not human-centered technologies. They are machine-centered systems that constantly give us the imagination of the human as both molecular and collective, but never individual, and hence always not quite measured up. That the way we are looking at the future of technologization, it feels that we are going to be measured in such extensive forms and supposed to be such particular types of humans that we're never going to be human enough. And this is not sudden or unexpected. In fact, we have been making these transitions because that is the promise of the digital. And I want to tease out the promise of the digital through 4 very brief snapshots from history of computation and the geography of its material unfolding, just to kind of make this point come through. The first story I have is actually from 1966. I don't know if there are people who are familiar with the history of robotics and computation, but this is Shaky. Basically, this is the grandfather of all your Roombas, right? The self-moving automatic vacuum cleaners that clean your floors. In 1966, basically when the Stanford Research Institute started this experiment, it was one of the most hyped television live cast ever, because Shaky, by using visual sensory apparatus and machine learning algorithms, was going to travel through a room which was 12 square meters wide and long. It had 6 objects and it was going to travel all by itself without bumping into any of those objects. Shaky took the first step into the room, and then it stopped, and it had a paralysis of 18 hours. For 18 hours, there was a live camera where people kept on waiting for it to move, and it couldn't. Simply because, at that point, Shaky was designed as a mathematical device. And it's perhaps necessary to make a distinction between mathematics and logic. So I don't want to do a big academic lecture, but let me just make this point very clear. If I were to throw this microphone into the air right now, I won't. But if I were to do it, you know what's going to happen, right? It's going to fall down. You don't need to understand gravity, you don't need to understand physics, you don't need to understand E is equal to mc squared in order to get any of it. You know that if things are thrown up into the Earth's atmosphere, they come down. And the reason you know it is actually logic. It is what you have done essentially is pattern recognition. You know that if one thing happens once, it might happen again. And if it happens again, it will happen multiple times. And then it can happen so many times that that is the only outcome, that is the probability of that action. A mathematician, on the other hand, if I had asked her this question of what will happen if I throw the mic, would have been completely paralyzed by fear, very much like Shaky. Because the mathematician would have to compute every single variable that is a possibility after I throw this microphone into the air. So a higher mathematician who, for example, subscribes to the quantum multiverse or multiple string theories and so on, would have to compute at least one possibility where when I throw the microphone, a wormhole opens up, the microphone travels through the wormhole, it goes into another dimension where another Nishant is giving this talk, and it falls on his head and kills him, thus giving us at least the first interesting interdimensional ethical dilemma of whether this is murder or suicide, right? Ridiculous as it sounds, a mathematician who has known that this is a possibility would definitely have to compute this. Largely because mathematics deals in the realm of possibility, which is what our computation devices were. But to make it into a possibility machine would have required such immense amount of quantum processing, storage, and memory that it became almost impossible for computers to do anything else. Hence, what we did was we designed our computers categorically to be probability or logic-driven. Machines which are no longer going to think of the realm of the possible, like arts and mathematics, but they are going to think about the realm of the probable, which is in terms of foreclosing the futures which are available to us. And in the process, we started looking at how the foreclosing of human futures happened. That we started expecting and designing more and more human behaviors and systems which were wedded to the probability of logic as opposed to the possibility of maths, right? So that's one promise of the digital that we have engineered through computation history. The second one is perhaps to look at the relationship between the humans and the machines in terms of who we see, what we are shown, and how this has always been tricky. So Jennifer Light reminds us from this wonderful picture from the ENIAC labs, for example, that the first women who we actually hired to work in computation were called computers. Right? These women who had fresh degree in maths and physics were actually called computers because they sat in mainframes which were more or less the size of this room, and they performed extraordinary complex computational and mathematical relationships and operations in order to reach an acquired result. This was in the 1940s and the 50s. By the time we reached 1990s, the computer became a democratic machine. It shrunk. It grew lesser in size. The role of the masculine engineer who designed the mainframe got replaced by chips and microchips and fast processing powers. And in those 50 years, as the computers shrunk, in the 1990s, we started a conversation about how women are not good at computing. Right? We need more women in STEM now. We need to do more science and technology and engineering education for girls to get into computation. In those 50 years, how did we go from women as computers to women as not good at computing? Is a story of the bodies which are erased from the history of technology and the future that it builds for us. In a less frightening space, perhaps, is the human workers who are continuously feeding machine learning algorithms in countries like India, where they are essentially trying to train an algorithm to understand whether what it is looking at is a muffin or a chihuahua. Right? Oftentimes, when we are faced with the future of artificial intelligence and machine learning, we keep on getting these incredibly opaque words like, oh yeah, machine learning, yeah, self-learning algorithms, oh yeah, it's like all networked and computational and connected. Essentially, what you are seeing is a way by which the human within the computational matrix is willfully erased before that particular result is achieved. So I want us to kind of think through how we are erasing the human while attributing creativity and learning to a computational software, and thinking about human as something that is mechanical and machinistic and doing repetitive tasks in that process. The third story I have is about the man called Hunter Moore, who was once upon a time called the internet's most hated man by The Guardian. So Moore, along with his sidekick Gary Evans, was responsible for the notorious but highly popular website called isanyoneUp.com. That was more or less the mecca for what is called revenge pornography. Revenge pornography, or non-consensual and forced circulation of sexual images of women, was a platform where users were invited to name, shame, blame, and tame the women that they were sexually engaged in. So they were generally producing videos and pictures of women as sluts, holding them up for public derision and threats of violence. Revenge pornography websites and portals celebrating frat boy and lad cultures continue to flood the internet. And for the longest time, revenge porn was being protected from persecution by free speech regulations, right? We don't want to censor anything, and so we will also not censor revenge pornography. It was in fact almost impossible to attack isanyoneup.com, and many had tried, because apart from the complexity of jurisdiction and sovereignty where the cases could be heard, there was a clear idea that at the level of content, this website was protected by the same rules that allow for user-generated pornography to proliferate online. So now, whether we agree with the entire genre of user-generated porn or not, what remains interesting is that this particular website was brought down by a mother-daughter duo in California whose names are Charlotte and Kayla Laws. In 2013, stolen images from Kayla Laws' iCloud account were found on this particular website, which then got in touch with her, connected her images to her Facebook and her Twitter account, and said that if you give $500, we will remove these images for you. Kayla's mother, Charlotte Laws, who's also a human rights and privacy lawyer, took up that opportunity to prove that this was not Kayla who had distributed images or some human person who had just surreptitiously taken information, but that Hunter Moore and Gary Evans had hacked into Kayla Laws' account, taken the data from it, and then distributed it without her consent. And it was that particular claim of data piracy and data theft which won over every single claim of the dignity, of the safety, the security, and the privacy of the woman that was being harassed in that particular instance. To make it a very simple case, what was protected here was not the person but the extraction and circulation of her data. What led to the judgment and the indictment was not the content of the speech, its meanings, the subject, her experience, but the act of leaking and a breach of data. And this is a radical reformulation of how we understand the domain of human protection. Because while the human might be protected in our older bouquet of rights, it now needs an additional layer, because with the Internet of Things, we are increasingly dealing with a world where things make us speak on our behalf, and force us into speech without consent or capacity to control the content. And this is a new condition of being that's constituted by peculiar conditions of computational architecture. So this is what Wendy Chun calls the habits of leaking, and people who were present for the reading group earlier this day, we kind of already talked about how network computation leaks this data, and in the process constructs a new human subject, not tied to our body, but constituted entirely through data streams and networks of computation. The last story I have is from India. We started there, I'm going to end it, to talk about a very particular case study that came up when we were doing live ethnography of this biometric citizen database project that India was making called Aadhaar. So right now, Aadhaar is one of the largest biometric database projects right now. It's 986 million records which are in this, in a country which has almost zero privacy laws and data protection regulation, right? So joy. I'm not going to go into the critique of Aadhaar right now, but what happened with Aadhaar was that it started as a voluntary service where people could register into it to get access to governmental services. And eventually, Aadhaar became a proof of citizenship, right? In many ways, it's now being used to say that if you have an Aadhaar, if you are the citizen of the country, then you need an Aadhaar card. And by corollary, then, if you have an Aadhaar, then that makes you a citizen. And in that logical framework, we accidentally ended up making a dog a legal citizen of the country. This is an actual ID card that was issued to a dog in India, and he became a legitimate citizen of the country with probably more rights than undocumented immigrants and people whose ethnicity often marks them as illegal in my country. Tied to this Aadhaar card, when we came across it, we first thought it's some kind of a hoax, right? Or of course it exists maybe because it's a data glitch and that eventually nobody is going to use it. But as we started following it, we realized that this dog card had 3 operational bank accounts, 2 financial and service transactions, and 6 subsidies for governmental rations and agricultural loans in its name. So we had a very simple question. Every time this dog card was used with biometric databases, there were human people who had to look at it and keep on saying, your dog needs a bank account. And the computing system says yes, because the dog is verified through the system. And the human person who could see that it's a dog still had to kind of go through the automated process of starting these accounts. And because the human agency was being replaced and superseded by the ability of the database to verify facts. Right? This is a different form, again, of verifying the human. You realize that this dog probably had more rights than a lot of the people who are right now under a military occupation in Kashmir or in the state of Assam, where they are basically, despite residency for many decades in the country, are being thought of as undocumented or illegal and being deported into the country of Bangladesh, where India shares a border. So I want to kind of look at these 4 particular movements to come back to the idea of the human and measurement. Because what I am proposing is that we have a new version of the human, which is an appified human. The human that is designed as an app, with a universal template and a customized drop-down menu, making the human into a modular data stream for batch and parallel processing, like computation often does, thus always keeping it as a granular and a representative of the collective, but never unique and never complete. A human that is shaped by probability models that drive robots. A human that is engaged with machines only to perform the residual task of identifying a muffin from a chihuahua, and unable to keep up with the ruthless efficiency of the machines it's working with. A human that will be less protected and less valued as more and more of it is read as information and data. A human that will be replaced by a dog and nobody would know the better. This is the appified human subject of the future. And this never quite human enough state is going to require an entirely different set of rights, protections, entitlements, and championing in order to ensure a human future of our technological presence. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot for this wonderful lecture. At this moment, I would like to open the floor for questions. Does anyone have a question? Thank you. Over there. Okay. Otherwise, I would have a question.
It's slightly embarrassing that I should ask this question because I should know the answer. Who made the dog's card? Who made the card for the dog?
So it actually says it in the dog's name itself. So his father, Sheru Singh, was actually a third-party intermediary who was entrusted with the enrolling forms of Aadhaar. So he basically put up his biometric data set and then wanted to create a separate account so that it wouldn't be tied to him, and basically generated this card. And all he had to do was make sure that at the first activation, he presented his fingerprints and his account numbers. And once the correlation happened in one database, every single database would no longer need a second level of verification, but would just look at the first level of verification and just continue down the system till the dog became just a legitimized citizen. Like, there was an actual court case to delegitimize this dog and make him a non-citizen again in order for the system to continue. I mean, it's just one of those bizarre stories of infrastructure and bureaucracy coming together around the digital.
Any other questions? I have one question. Over there? Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much, Nishant, for this overwhelming talk. So, in my experience, there seems to be a temporal delay between the moment that a scale is set up and then the moment that there's a body that is supposed to live up to that scale. The two never seem to meet. And I wonder, are we doomed to perpetually live in this kind of devilish dance? Or might there be the chance, without some kind of intentional designing entity, that the two might actually one day meet?
Wow, that's a great question, and I'm sorry to overwhelm people, but yeah, it's an overwhelming topic. It could have been worse. Thanks for bringing the notion of time into this equation, because I think there is something there in terms of time, measurement, and scale, which might be worth thinking through. So, one of my collaborators, we are working on a book on fakeness. Her name is Alexandra Juhas. Has a wonderful title for an essay which said something weird happened to time in the age of computation. And I have kind of understood it as this. With almost all the pre-digital technologies, or at least let's say pre-computational technologies, time and technology had one very simple relationship, that our past was fixed and our futures are up for prediction. Right? So all technologies kind of historicize us so that a fixity can be made while continuously opening up the new possibilities of the future. With computation, when it starts recording the human at a granular level, at a level of DNA as opposed to conversations, at the level of molecular and nanotechnological levels as opposed to the bodily and the material, it produces something very weird. Suddenly our past or our history seems to be open for prediction. So has anybody taken those ridiculous DNA testing thingies with 23andMe or something like that, where you send a sample of your DNA and then three weeks later a report comes in and it tells you are 168th Scandinavian, which suddenly puts you in figuring out which of your great-grandparent was like really the adulteress or the adulterer in their family? Because I always thought I was like pure Gujju Indian boy. And then suddenly my DNA profile comes up and says 168th Scandinavian and 140th Portuguese. And it does all kinds of predictions about my biological body, but also my racial identity, which is supposed to give me a profound truth and knowledge about who I am, right? My past, apparently through extraordinary measurement, is now in sync with the scale of prediction. At the same time, the future that is already given to us seems to grow smaller and smaller in terms of the scripts that we can follow. With facial recognition technologies, with different forms of advanced cross-database verifications and so on, there are only a few conditions of your future which are available, and that's a scarce commodity. Whereas, your future is now narrated and your past is predicted. And that inversion seems to really fundamentally hit at our formulation of what the human subject is going to be. Because very much like Andrew Clark's Subjects of Time, we have not imagined a future that is free of history. And what will happen if historical pasts are subject to incredible revisions? And for those of us who are right now occupying some geographies of authoritarian regimes, we know what that revision of history does. The government in my home country, India, right now, has systematically, for example, been erasing all Islamic and Mughal contributions to India by merely suggesting that they did not exist. I'm almost certain that collectively they hate the Taj Mahal because, if anybody knows three things about India, it's Taj Mahal, chai, tea, and yoga. And chai and yoga can be claimed onto Hinduism, but the Taj Mahal remains an Islamic monument. So apart from that, they are trying very hard to erase and revise everything from the history to make a right-wing claim of being a Hindu country for Hindu people, which throws everybody out. And these kind of recordings, which are measurements of the human way below anything that we understood in terms of skin, ethnicity, markers of different identities, and the capacity to open them up for predictions is definitely something worth teasing out. And I'm not completely yet given into the gloom and doom, saying this is inescapable. But I think that within arts, humanities, and human rights programming, it's going to be our task to reconceptualize what it means to be human when these are the kinds of technological measurements which are being put upon us. So I think it's in the making right now, so it's not a lost cause. But if we don't kind of act upon it, it is eventually going to reach to a future that is at least alarming, if not downright scary. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have a few more minutes left. Is there anyone else that has a question?
Or a comment?
A comment, observation? I think then we leave it to this. I would like to give a warm applause to Nishant Shah.